Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson. So today I was able to go out to Patagonia, Arizona and meet Gary Paul Nabhan and spend some time with him out on his land. We got to sit in his contemplative garden, and I even got to meet his wife and get to know her a little bit. It was such a beautiful day. Gary Paul Nabhan has written over 30 books. He's got quite the resume, and he's always devoted his life to helping others and learning and exploring, and he's taken a different path that's less traveled. I was first introduced to his book, The Desert Smells Like Rain, a few years ago, which is fascinating, and I've listened to him on a few other podcasts. And I just always appreciated who he is and how he thinks. Gary is an agricultural ecologist, ethnobotanist, ecumenical Franciscan brother, and author whose work has focused primarily on the interaction of biodiversity and cultural diversity of the arid binational Southwest. He is considered a pioneer in the local food movement and the heirloom seed saving movement. He co-founded the Native Seed Search while working at the University of Arizona, both organizations co-hosting the first ever national conference on the community-based seed banks and heirloom seed saving. Gary's been a part of so many different interesting, impactful, collaborative efforts, and he does seem to be very humble when you ask him about his impacts that he has been a part of. He truly is a humble and kind person, and it was just such a pleasure to sit with him and get to know him. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and don't forget to subscribe to the iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube channels and rate the show. Thanks a lot, and enjoy. Well, thank you for doing this, Gary.
Oh, I'm so grateful to be with you.
I'm grateful to be with you. I've been looking forward to this, and I knew it would happen eventually. And you're somebody that I've looked up to and listened to for some time now, and I thought it would be nice to try and capture some of your essence and your wisdom and your life story and share it with people anywhere, anyone who's lucky to listen. And I think I come from a place where a lot of people probably have not been exposed to your words and your ideas and who you are. And the podcasts that I've heard you on before and your books that I've gotten into, I've realized those people are in a small niche circle, and they know you and they love your work and probably follow you and have deep relationships with you. But I also think it's important for the younger generation and people that are outside of the box to hear your work and to try to cultivate that relationship that you've built with the planet and plants and food. And so that's where we're coming from.
Well, great. The first time you called me and started to talk, I just knew that you had this spark that is perfect for this kind of dialogue, that I felt at home with you, and that you're on a path that means a lot to me, because we all need to support one another on these journeys.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I felt the same with you. You're easy to listen to. I think I told you on that phone call that you remind me of Stuart Brand. And it's your voice and your curiosity and you're passionate about what you do and who you are and exploring nature. And so there is something to that comparison that you just reminded me of him. And I've always appreciated Stuart Brand.
Well, I knew him briefly when I was younger, but some of his closest friends, like Peter Warshall, who lived for 30 years in Tucson, helped him with the Whole Earth Catalog, and then with Coevolution Quarterly, which I wrote for. I was too young for Stuart's big Whole Earth Catalog project, but I carried it around like the Bible number 2 when I was a kid. And all of that meant a lot to me because it opened a lot of people's minds and hearts.
Beautiful. Yeah, I would have loved that too at that time, especially. Such a new project and something so profound. And getting the picture of planet Earth on that cover was such a big deal for the environmental movement and things of that nature.
Well, sometimes younger people don't realize how much of an impact that first photo of looking back at Earth from the rest of the universe meant to us to see the whole Earth and realize humbly what a small part of the universe we travel on.
Yeah.
And so you don't think that a photo itself could change consciousness, but in ways it did in a beautiful way.
Yeah. How cool. I have it in my home and a bunch of other beautiful pictures of space. It's just so humbling. So, yeah, I thought what we could do is start with some of your newer projects that you're working on, because it sounds like you've got your hands full, of course, and you always have, and then work our way back to see how you even got to be where you're at today and hear some of that trajectory, if you're okay with that.
Sure, I'll follow your questions.
Cool. So you mentioned on the phone, we had a very brief phone chat, that you were doing some work with the borders. And I've listened to a couple of your podcasts, and I heard some things about preserving the plants when they were building the borders. And I also heard a little bit about you helping people across the border during COVID that were not able to have access to resources and food. And so it just seems like you really serve people. You're very contemplative, and you meditate, and you seem to work from the mind and the spirit, but you also seem to have your hands busy, and you actually engage, and you're active, and you do things, and you create change in the world. And you've written many books, and you've changed many lives. So I'd love to hear what your newest projects are.
Well, just this month, I've launched a wonderful collaboration with some of the people I admire the most in the world, both in the spiritual realm. Uh, Mary Evelyn Tucker of the Forum on Religion and Ecology, and spiritual leaders from 5 different tribes, but also plant conservationists and people who think about how we protect sacred places wherever they are in the world. And my particular niche, because I'm a Franciscan brother and a botanist, is how we can take better care of the sacred plants that are used in rituals, seasonal rituals, annual ceremonies, rites of passage, and make sure that those plants that are often part of contemplative practice as incense or as talismans or touchstones, how we can make sure that they're still around for the next generation. So we've started this Sacred Plant Biocultural Recovery Initiative that will have its first 2 projects that are rolling out now. One on the U.S.-Mexico border, where we are right now, about 12 miles north of the border. And I'll talk about those elements in a moment, but also in the war-torn Middle East, where my Lebanese American grandfather was born, and where I still have cousins, and where I've worked with conservation groups in the past.
Amazing.
And the idea is to really go into places that have been damaged and heal those wounds by having spiritual leaders that know those plants teach younger people with the technical assistance from people we call restoration ecologists or nurserymen and botanists that know the particular plants in the area, so we have the right match of the plant with the environment. And of course, spiritual elders of Indigenous and Hispanic Catholic communities know the common names for the plants, but don't know all the scientific names. And sometimes there's confusion about that if you just buy one from a nursery. But most of these plants are not in nurseries. They're something that have very restricted ranges. There's one just 8 miles south of us called the Corona del Cristo. And it's a plant that's on the federal list of threatened and endangered plant species. And when I started to study it, people here in this community of Patagonia, Hispanic people, said, well, we've always done little pilgrimages out there. Holy Week, which ends with Easter for them. And we revere that plant because it always blooms at Easter time,
Mm.
and its inflorescence, its cluster of flowers, is shaped like Christ's crown
Mm.
of thorns. And I was really curious, like, that's so interesting. An absolutely beautiful flower, sort of a pale lavender that blooms for just 10 days a year.
Wow.
People paid attention to,
Mm-hmm.
and then compared to this thorny, sort of brutal
Crucifixion.
crucifixion
Mm-hmm.
that is, in ways, one of the horrors of the Western world. And why would something so beautiful be compared to that crown of thorns?
Mm.
And of course, it's the shape of a crown-like cluster. But then I learned that for the first 400 years after that crown of thorns, the original one, as legends go, was taken off and sheltered so it couldn't be damaged, that it bloomed every year at Easter time.
It's amazing.
And it was taken to Istanbul and kept in the Orthodox Church for years before it was moved to France. But they say that all the time that it was still in the Middle East, it bloomed with triggers from their climate, I suppose, right at Easter time. And somehow that story, or elements of it, ended up here in little Patagonia of 800 people.
That's amazing.
3,000 miles away from where that legend began.
Yeah.
And I'm so touched by stories like that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Storytellers, us humans, and how they're the most important thing. That's what we're doing here, is even just trying to capture and tell these stories, because otherwise they fade and they disappear, and we're amnesic almost.
That's right. We call it erasure, that some of these things are so heartbreaking that we try to forget them or suppress them. And I think that's one of the parts of this new project and our previous project along the border during the 4 years when the border wall was being constructed. And I'm not going to go into all the politics of it. My approach isn't about the politics, but it's about how we heal the wounds that occurred from that walk, because there was enormous amount of traumatic stress among the Indigenous and Hispanic people that live along the border, who used to freely walk across that border.
Yeah, and all the plant life that's destroyed along the way.
And that's right. So at Quito Baquito, where in 1980 to 1982 I did my dissertation on plants of the border, there's 14 different sacred and ceremonial plants, but the ones that cause the most grief to see killed and mutilated and destroyed by the Tohono Nation and the Hyachid Nation. The Hyachid people, it can be translated as sand dune people or in the sand people. Tohono people, the desert people, are the people of a luminous place, which is how they think of the desert. And their tradition is that the saguaro is a person because it emerged from a young child who sank into the ground, and when he came back up above the ground, he was a saguaro. I can't divulge all the details of that because I'm not an Autumn tribal member or citizen, but this is what elders have told me. And that the Autumn just never hurt a saguaro in any way if they can at all avoid it, because it's another person, another sentient being. So during the time of all this grief, we worked with a group of traditional elders of 3 tribes that have a presence along the border, and assisted the Tohono O'odham Nation Legislative Council with a resolution that declared that saguaros have legal status or personhood and are a sentient being, a sacred being that deserves protection not only on reservation but throughout the historic homelands of O'odham people, which stretch to where we're seated right now
Yeah.
in Patagonia and all the way over towards Yuma. And that resolution passed all 12 or 14 district councils unanimously, went before the legislative council. The tribal governor signed it, tribal chairman signed it.
Mm.
So that's one of the first laws in the country giving a sacred plant personhood, legal personhood.
It's amazing. And you were a big part of helping that to happen, which is pretty
Well,
cool.
I'm never a big part of anything. I'm not trying to be humble, but I always work in collaborations
Mm-hmm.
with other people. So it is. I attribute the success of that to our friends who are elected officials out there.
Mm.
Austin Nunez of Santa Vera district near Tucson, Lorraine Eiler, head of the Hyachid-O'odham Alliance and the current tribal chair of the Tohono-O'odham, Verlin Jose and his son Kendall, and they really moved this through and made sure that the language was a language of their own people, because it was a multicultural group of us who wrote the first draft, and then they fine-tuned it to really be a document of their people. We just guided some of the language along, so I don't take credit for that.
Sure.
I love working in cross-cultural groups on issues of the sacred and the importance of contemplative practice, and how when we get out and heal the land together, the land heals us.
And it seems to transcend all of our ideologies and political standpoints. And you seem to have an ability to, in your own life, find language and ways to do that and to get below it and see what we can connect on and what our differences are, but our similarities are, and what we can actually work towards together, which I think I really appreciate about you.
Well, I love that phrase you just used, get below it, because sometimes when there's a cross-cultural conflict or even an interpersonal conflict, starting off with a debate about that in words doesn't get us where we want to be. So we do need to get below it.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found is if we get down in the trenches and people of different races, classes, ethnicities, spiritual traditions are passing a potted plant one hand to the next, getting down on their knees. It's almost like an act of prayer in and of itself, and helping each other plant trees. The ideological barriers between us fly away.
Yeah.
And that somehow by getting down into it below words to where our bodies, our hands are collaborating, we're breathing at the same pace, we are changed in a way that changes the words that we use for or with one another. And so sometimes starting with a wordy analysis of the problem doesn't get us where we want to be.
Right. It seems more to do the opposite, where people immediately get triggered and they already have their pre-existing ideas, and then they double down on those instead of, hey, let's let those go for a minute and let's get to what's under, which even I think you've mentioned it might be in some way of eating together and getting to what, that's maybe the biggest bridge we have as a culture, as a giant, as a collective culture, the food.
Well, food is so interesting that it's the most direct way we take in the world around us other than breathing. And it does more than nourish us in terms of calories. It nurtures us spiritually and emotionally. And that in my Arab traditions, when someone comes at your door, you not only welcome them, even though it may be a stranger that you might in another instance be fearful of, but you offer water and you offer a date before you say anything to the person. In other words, what does a desert dweller need as the essence of of surviving, water and a bit of food, so that their body can recover and then they can be in conversation. So that gesture of graciousness before talking, proselytizing, interrogating, you offer water and a food from the desert to another desert dweller, I think goes back thousands of years, and its durability tells us something about how well it worked.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. Makes most sense too, because my favorite part of my culture that I'm going to miss when I leave 20 years I'm at now with fire culture is the eating together, the cooking together, the camaraderie element of that is my favorite part. And people can laugh at that, but at the end of the day, everybody agrees that that's what we can all bond together, and that goes back thousands and through all of history.
Every culture, when we use the word communion, now it seems relegated to something that just Christian people practice. And it's absolutely broader than that, and every culture has some equivalent of that. They may not call it the Eucharist or communion, but is it a communal act of good faith in one another and in hoping to reach out and hear another person and to share something tangible with them? Absolutely. And from being up in Alaska fishing with Inuit fishermen and whalers to being in the tropical rainforest of Colombia with people who make their living off the foods of the forest, it just seems so universal.
And then I've heard you speak of the unfortunate situation where the people that grow our food and, the farmers and the imbalance of them having to go to soup kitchens and be impoverished and all of that. And then in our culture, and it goes all the way back to Christ's time, same scenario, which was in your book, Jesus. And what was the title of that book?
Jesus for Farmers and Fishers.
Beautiful. Yeah. The concepts in that book, but it's like those same problems existed then that exist now. And that's unfortunate.
Sometimes I feel grateful that I grew up with a grandfather who was a fruit peddler, and my uncles and my father would go up the shores of Michigan into what they call the fruit belt there and pick fruit and bring it back to the Chicago and Detroit areas and then spread it out among little independent groceries. But our family did not disparage during the physical work of harvesting. And for many African Americans from the South, it was something oppressive and brutal for them, picking cotton or picking fruit or whatever. And the same thing with the desert. I've always had a very positive view of the desert, that the expanses of the desert have this radiance and elegance that to me almost triggers contemplative practice. And I feel this reverence for the landscape that I'm looking out on. But I have to admit that deserts can also be brutal. And this last year, 30,000 farm workers, tree trimmers, firefighters who work outdoor in the brutal sun of the desert, 30,000 more died last year, 2023, in the border states than ever before in American history. So when we're reaching 120, 125 degrees in Phoenix and Yuma, and your only option is to work outside to feed your family, we're putting people in harm's way who bring us our daily bread.
Yeah. And then the imbalance of the money that they make to not even be able to afford the food and the nourishment and the lifestyle that they should be able to afford. That's pretty wild.
Yeah, the last book I did called The Gavi Spirits, we did the numbers for how much the men with those very sharp tools called hemas, the men are called hemadores. They hit agave plants 800 times a day to shape the living century plants into something that looks like a pineapple before it's roasted to make distilled tequila. But for a margarita that's sold in Phoenix at $12 a margarita and maybe a $2 tip on that, that worker gets 0.001 cents of the economic benefits of that margarita being sold. So they get an infinitesimal part of that, even though they do the essential work in that food chain.
That's incredibly weird, isn't it? It's like hard to wrap your head around.
I know. I mean, and when we've told bartenders that, who also work hard and have to live off tips more than their salaries, I saw 40 bartenders erupt with tears. They just said, we thought we weren't getting paid satisfactorily, and we've never thought about what that farm worker who cuts the agaves that are distilled into the tequilas and mezcals, we make margaritas from what they get paid. And they were just grief-stricken. And so that kind of bridging the gap of finding empathy between the farm workers and the bartenders who are at one or the other end of the whole food supply chain has been deeply moving to me, that they're building alliances now toward a kind of food justice that we've never experienced in the Americas.
All through storytelling, too, and making people aware that it's even happening.
That's right.
That's the most powerful thing, is to like bring the awareness first to create the emotional response that then creates the ability to even have a creative process, because everybody gets activated in their own unique way then come forth with their own ideas of how can I, with my unique perspective, contribute. And that's a collective effort that's always been the human condition. Is it seems like creating and discovering. You discover and you create in this symbiotic relationship. And as you become aware of certain things, you become more creative in that same process.
And I had never thought about bartenders as ambassadors or storytellers until we started to work on that project, where of all the people in the whole supply chain, from when an agave is planted, a century plant is planted in a desert field, to when it shows up in a bar, they're the ones that have the storytelling capabilities to reach directly to a consumer. No one else in that supply chain has that direct contact with the consumer. So if the bartender speaks with empathy about, well, I'd suggest this one because they're doing fair trade work and they're providing extra services and health benefits to the workers, you'll never have any regret if you drink this mezcal or tequila because they're doing it right. We want a healthy industry. We want a healthy food industry. So we're not disparaging workers who, have to spray pesticides. They're not making that choice. The people above them are making that choice. But we need to eat and drink in a way that we're not putting others in harm's way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And that seems to be, I'm just seeing all these patterns of this big boom in the agave industry because of the mezcal boom and the tequila boom. But then you're at the same exact time finding people that are in the I care place that want to do the right thing. So there's these like ethical standards being developed. And same thing with the psychedelic renaissance, which has been going on and on. There's multiple renaissances, but this bigger one that's going the medical model is, there's a lot of exploitation and bad investors and all the things that go south that could just destroy the indigenous cultures and the plant medicines and people's lives if done the wrong way.
You're absolutely right. I mean, as someone who's had traumatic brain injuries and vision disabilities from accidents, prescribed psilocybin mushrooms in small doses, had an enormous role in helping me regain some of my vision cognition capacities. So I don't disparage anyone who has suffered a disability that's trying to imagine, can a psychedelic plant help me in any way and speed up my recovery, open up brain passageways that have been damaged or blocked? And we know that is technically what's happening in many cases. But we now know that there's also a recreational demand for some of those things. And in my ethics, our first care goes to the spiritual communities that have used those plants all along, to make sure that they have access to the plants, the plant populations that they've been the caretakers for all along. We now know in Mexico, for a variety of plants and animals that have hallucinogens, that the cartel is actually kidnapping some of those spiritual caretakers, saying, where are you getting that plant or animal? We want to have it part of our menu of drugs for recreational users in Europe and the United States. It's not only robbing people access for a spiritual tradition that may have gone on for years or decades or centuries, it's also imperiling the plants and animals. And I don't think any of us wants to see that. And most of the people who have turned to these plants for legitimate therapy certainly don't want to endanger a plant that has helped save their own life. So we have to turn them into advocates for the kind of plant and animal conservation that will allow this to be available to future generations, but really make sure that the original caretaking communities, Indigenous or Buddhist or otherwise, have the primary access and are in on the decision making about all of that.
And then the war on drugs, that's been a big problem, obviously, with that too, and the amount of money that's been made and the amount of corruption that sort of stems from that whole idea that there's a war on something. It's a war on consciousness at some degree, in my opinion, but it could be looked at from so many different angles, but it's never really kept anyone from doing drugs. It's just created a whole ripple effect of dominoes falling in different directions and profits to be made and exploitation.
That's right. And unfortunately, our war on for over 50 years on marijuana, that's now being legalized not only medically but recreationally in so many places, has meant that the cartels have turned to much more deadly drugs to sell our kids.
The fentanyls.
And it's heartbreaking if you've ever dealt with someone who's just had trouble with fentanyl or the opioids. You just want them to have their life back. It changes the way their brain works, and it takes not months but years to get them out of it. And there has to be a huge support group. It can't just be trying DMT or any other substance just once in an isolated way. They really need a support group, just like people in Alcoholics Anonymous or Gambling Anonymous do. We need to help one another get through those times of psychic crises. We can't do it alone.
I've been lucky to meet some incredible people that have created some programs. One's called Being True to You. They're psychedelic integration coaching. They prepare you, they help you go through the process, and then they help you integrate that so that you can get back into, your normal everyday experience in a healthy way. And they seem to be tied to so many beautiful resources, and there's good people doing good work.
And I think we need to ask ourselves, why did the war on drugs happen in the societies that villainized it through propaganda, that even marijuana was something from the devil, and literally the propaganda from our own government looked like that. And one of the false assumptions was that psychedelics were used by primitive people, but no Western religion ever had any tradition of psychedelics in them. And we now know that's not even true, that
Right.
I'm not saying that psychedelics dominated Christianity or Judaism or Islam, but we know that plants like Syrian rue and ergo and I can keep on
Mm-hmm.
naming plants were both used as infusions in wine and in other drinks
Mm-hmm.
for ecstatic ceremonies. But we also know that the use of incense is in ways mind altering. It is a metaphor for being in contact with the invisible. The fragrance reminds us that we're in contact with the larger
Mm-hmm.
universe, the heavens, however, whatever metaphor you want to use, but we don't see it. And
Yeah.
we recognize that there's things invisible in our lives that are also very, very tangible and healing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I, I think when we're talking about sacred plant recovery, we're certainly not talking just about psychedelics. We want to care for those incense plants. We want to care for other ones that heal our bodies from toxins.
Yeah.
That all of these came in one way or another in Western religions, not just in so-called indigenous religions that were disparaged as being
Yeah.
primitive. And now the revival of interest in these things is resetting
Mm-hmm.
that balance and perspective that these plants, like you and I, can, depending on their behavior and context, hurt or heal
Yeah.
someone. And the plant itself isn't sacred. It's our relationship with it.
Yeah.
And that's my big beef about environmental conservation to date and why some Americans don't feel connected to it. And I think it's that they think like, well, why are you so focused on protecting that thing? Things come and go.
Mm.
But it's not that I'm interested in a plant as a thing. I'm interested in the relationality between humans and certain plants
Yeah.
that have whatever we want to call it, spiritual power or supernatural power. Supernatural is a loaded word, of course,
Yeah.
for a natural plant,
Sure.
but I think English sometimes lacks the vocabulary to make us feel comfortable with some of these uh, concepts. But to me, what we need to be conserving is relationships,
Mm-hmm.
interactions that have held true and benefited humans and other species for millennia, if not tens or hundreds of millennia.
Yeah. I agree. That's beautifully said. And the big pharmaceutical industries right now have gotten so huge and so off the rails in a certain way where they're exploiting and patenting and owning. And I wanted to get into your ideas about, monoculture and seed banks and all this
Yeah,
stuff and how you think about seeds and diversity of plants. But like the Amazon rainforest is pretty much where all the pharmaceuticals are at some degree coming from. But the relationship to it from the scientist to where we're
uh,
getting these things, it just seems so disconnected, you know?
well, I have to laugh about what you just said because my first career mistake, you've already heard my values, was when the U.S. tried to align its laws about plant patenting to make it more possible for a wider range of plants to align it with those of the common market or the European Union. And uh, two friends of mine back east, one that just won the World Food Prize, Carrie Fowler, called me and said, we need a scientist from a university, and now you're junior faculty in the ag school, to come out and talk against plant patenting
Mm,
because of that usurping the rights of farmers and indigenous people who were the primary ones who shaped these plants that we now use as food or medicine.
mm-hmm.
So I went to Washington and they said, you have a tie in a sports jacket, don't you? And I said, I don't own a tie or sports jacket. Okay, let's take you to Salvation Army before we go and let you talk in Congress. And so I spoke out in Congress against plant patenting because I said we don't have the right to patent another life.
Right.
That's just my ethics.
Right.
I got back to the university and they said, "You're on probation. You can't." They wanted, if you were speaking on our behalf as a university, you can't speak out about that because we have all kinds of
Funding.
From people who were helping get income for the university from those patents. And I said, well, here's my statement. I specifically said in the first 2 minutes that I don't represent the university. I'm there to give voice to the plants who weren't invited to this congressional hearing.
I love that.
And I got off probation.
Yeah.
But
That's
I
amazing.
was also shunned by the other faculty members and
Sure.
finally left for a nonprofit that I started.
That's amazing. Yeah, but that's a powerful statement. And there needs to be more people that do that, because what happens is your paycheck relies upon these special interests or the funding's coming. So a lot of academics right now are stuck in an echo chamber or stuck in these
Well, it's
not moral elements of, and that's where it's coming from.
yeah.
The
I think
funding
we have that crisis
in so many
right
dimensions.
now in so many universities, and we have 200 universities at this very moment in history where the students and the administration are at odds with one another over ethical issues. And I don't want to go into whether the students have been offline or the administration offline, but I think we're at a new turning point where we need to get that right, or our whole system of higher education is going to crumble.
Yeah, it almost seems like it is crumbling. And it's a matter of, is it going to reinvent itself in a new way alongside it, or is it going to, but that seems to be a larger degree. It seems like society as a whole is finding itself in this hospice situation.
Well, that's right, but there's also something that from your own background, that when you start to delve into some of the issues that now occupy a lot of your contemplative practice and your own reading and all of that, we have to read about things in other disciplines that we weren't trained in. So the internet, its one blessing is that we now have access to information that's sort of decoded from academic jargon that we can all begin to understand and draw upon, even if you or I didn't have a master's degree or PhD in that particular thing.
Right.
We're learning to learn in a broader way than we ever have before.
Yeah.
And so many of the concerns and values that you and I share don't come from any single discipline, faith, or entity like a university.
Yep.
It's because our reading and our dialogue with other people is much more eclectic.
Yeah. And you seem to have taken a path way before the internet and way before you had access to information to leave school and to find yourself working where you found yourself more naturally inclined to be. And that led you to be very educated in your own way that got you away from that different type of education. But I look up to that. I always think people that are pioneers and carve their own path of curiosity, they do become the generalists, and they find their own avenues of curiosity and can have a huge impact. So it doesn't have to go that route of traditional.
Right. I mean, I dropped out of high school for multiple reasons. I was kind of a badass in ways, but also my family was moving out of our school district, and the school didn't want to offer me my senior year in high school back where I'd been going. They said, no, you've got some trouble here. You have to go to another school. And I didn't want to go to another school. So I dropped out. I worked on railroad crews in a sewage treatment plant and steel mills. And then I thought, well, college is looking a little bit more interesting. And I got in on one on probation. But within 6 months, I'd taken a leave from college to go work at the First Earth Day headquarters. And so those informal opportunities, non-formal education. I was with brilliant people at that Earth Day headquarters. in Washington, D.C., it ends up that some of my best mentors have been outside of academia, and I'm sure that's true for you, that
Mm-hmm.
older women and men that just sort of see something in you that they want to help assure you that it's okay that you're exploring some of the things that you're exploring, and they set up some guideposts for you so you don't get lost.
Yeah.
But they're not telling you what to do, they're helping you find your way.
Mm-hmm.
Those mentors for me, only maybe 1 in 10 came from my university professors. Most of them came from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
Farmers and spiritual leaders and poets and contemplatives.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And I've realized when I was young, I couldn't stand reading because it was always like, you need to do a book report and read this book. And it was this almost tyrannical form of,
Right.
this is how you learn. Here's what to learn. And as I got older and curious, I realized how thirsty I was to read. And I read a book a week, and I have for years now, because I'm thirsty and I'm able to read what I want to read and about the
That's right.
subjects I'm interested in. And my YouTube history is just like a bunch of people talking, and my mom makes fun of, why do you listen to people talk all the time? And I'm like, that's what I like to do. It's
Yeah.
it's people teaching me and telling me their stories about the nature of reality. And it could be Richard Feynman to, some botanist to, it could be anyone. But I love learning. And when I was a young man, I think I would have, but it was that format that a lot of young kids, it's like curiosity's beaten out of you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier in the day when we were uh, talking that the Wonder Junkie name for the podcast comes from Carl Sagan, first scientist that used the term symbiosis,
Mm-hmm.
and then coined another term, holobiont, that suggests that regardless of what our egos think, each of us is a plant and animal and microbial community, that there's 10,000 more cells of other genomes, different bacteria and viruses and parasitic worms and earwigs in and on our body than our cells of our own genome.
Mm-hmm.
So each of us is a community of faith with other organisms
Right.
that, regardless of what pronouns we use after our name, or how we've been taught to stroke our own ego,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of our ego, the pronouns we should all be using are we and ours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Like Wade Davis has a lot of elements of his. You've probably come across a
I
lot of his.
love Wade.
I love
Yeah,
him. He's such a good bridge builder in that way of like helping us to see so many cultures from someone who lived in those cultures. And like, what is it that makes us human? I think he's probably one of the best people alive to do that for us if we ever can really hold him to that standard. I think a lot of people will
yeah,
never come across his work, unfortunately.
yeah.
But
I feel the same way, that I would rather read Wade Davis and Mark Plotkin and Alan Weissman and Paul Stamets and Andrew Weil than two-thirds of the stuff in uh, technical journals, because these people are totally technically competent in
yeah.
what they do,
Mm-hmm.
but they are good storytellers and they care.
Yeah. And they've lived through the experience of having those cultural experiences to really know.
Yeah, and
They didn't just read about it.
I should also say that I just mentioned 5 men, and let me mention 5 women who
Yeah.
every one of your listeners should read. Robin Kimmerer and Suzanne Simard, and the poet Patty Ann Rogers, and Cassandra Quave, a medicinal plant uh, explorer, and one more poet, Allison Deming, who lives up in Tucson, who's a dear friend of
Mm,
mine. And they are bridging this world between science and storytelling in a beautiful way.
awesome. I'll make sure I put that in like the show notes with links to their work because I know I'll be thirsty for that stuff too. So
Uh,
I'm curious. I'm sure you have plenty of experience when you're trying to get to know, say, Native American culture or any cultures, working with their particular plant medicines. And particularly psychedelic medicines, you've used psilocybin to heal yourself. And I wonder if that was like one of the first, or if it came later, or if you've spent any time in your life being really curious about the nature of consciousness through psychedelic experiences and plant
Yeah.
medicines.
Well, as someone who is trained in ethnobotany, the field where a lot of the first studies of psychedelics emerged from, with Richard Evans Schultes and
Mm-hmm.
Wasson and others. I was in that generation with their students, Mark Plotkin and Andy Weil and Wade Davis, are direct descendants of those guys that I just mentioned. And so I was always around people who studied psychedelics and was very intellectually interested in them. But at the same time, because of my Arab American background, I was very, very interested in the foods, and my wife is an expert on the medicines. So I sort of stung closely to that and never asked Indigenous people directly about those things that I considered part of their esoteric knowledge of traditional plants. And then because I'd just been around some spiritual leaders so long, they said, you've never asked us about this. Can we initiate you?
Yeah.
And I said, well, I'm outside your culture, and I don't want. I'm not an Indian wannabe. I mean, what do you mean, initiate me? And they said, look, you've worked with us for 20 years, and there's a dimension of our culture that I don't think you get, and I don't think you can really be of help to us if you don't understand that other dimension. And then they would invite me into private ceremonies, not like I was invited into, everything they did.
Sure.
And again, I had a rite of passage, but I really wouldn't call it an initiation into their tribe at all. I disparage that kind of presumptuousness. But so both in South America and in Mexico, and I've had experience with hallucinogens where I did not invite myself in. I was asked to join a group of people who I'd known for some time, and then I saw what remarkable skill their spiritual leaders have in both doing an evaluation of someone to see whether they're ready to take a hallucinogen, of then monitoring during a ceremony so that they keep people safe, and taking care of them afterwards, because a lot of the revelations roll out. You don't immediately understand something, and you have to work through it over months sometimes. And so both with ceremonies, including psychedelics, and ceremonies that include what I call psychotropics, which is a broader group of plants that alter our minds subtly. Even chili peppers can do that.
Yeah.
It often took me months to unpack what I got out of those ceremonies. And to some extent, it gently taught me about how my own mind works and doesn't work. I've had disabilities since I was a kid, speech disabilities, lisping and stuttering. Then from accidents, eye disabilities, I see two images in one eye and one in another, and my brain works 15 times harder to reconcile them. And so I've used psychedelics to help deal with that. But I've also been diagnosed variously for every A word in the psychiatric manual, Asperger's, attention deficit syndrome, highly functioning autism, etc. And I'm not disparaging those labels. I'm sure some practitioners, once they take people through those tests, they can really help pinpoint how to help them. But I would say that the psychotropic plants help me understand my own capabilities and disabilities and where I should be a little bit gentler about my disabilities than I had been, because with all of us who have disabilities, you get bullied because of them. You have self-shame, but if you go through enough contemplative practice, you turn those wounds into gifts that can perhaps help other people.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. That's beautiful. That's it's an important message to share with people, because you would never guess that you had had those disabilities of speech. And not to say it's a panacea or it's the way to go, but you're bringing up some of the reasons why we should consider these things as tools and as medicines, and
Yeah.
be careful as we go,
Yeah, there was one moment, and I won't tell the plant, but I felt like the spiritual leader was inside my head talking to me and walking me through my brain
It's
and
amazing.
saying, well, here's what's going on here that's kind of blocked, and
Mm-hmm.
here you're in a pulse metabolism where um, you don't have continuing flow of some of these synapses, and so you have to jump to assumptions because you're missing pieces of the information. And sometimes your assumptions are dead wrong. And other times you're way ahead of other people. So friends around you might say, well, that was really prophetic, but it was because you're used to leaping because you don't have all the information, and you never will,
Mm-hmm.
because of these brain disabilities. But you better know that every time you get it right, there's probably 5 times you get it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So don't ever think you're a prophet, because you'll lead yourself and lead other people astray. I mean, what they meant when they said, oh, you just said something prophetic, means, hey, Gary, for once you got it right.
Yeah.
Be humble about it.
Yeah. You have a really deep humility about you. I'm curious if you seem to have those qualities about you when you were a young man, like in your 20s, 30s, or was it something that you just kept aiming for? Were there teachers that helped you with that? Or
Oh, I think I had some great teachers, and yet I had a lot of failures. I broke up with partners who I still love because it was probably hard to live with.
mm-hmm.
Been estranged from my kids off and on, and I know a lot of cultural creatives who say the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the person who really helped me with all of that was Richard Rohr, one of the best-selling spiritual contemplative writers in the history of the United States right
Mm-hmm.
now. And he's been here at our house with us. I took a 2-year program with him. And the
Cool.
first day of the program, he said, this program's for 114 of you in our second class. You'll be involved for 2 years in contemplative practice. But over 1,000 people applied for those slots, and we're only taking the people who admitted that they've had terrible failures in their life and done things that were really tragic for them. Anyone who glossed over their problems and just wants to airbrush their biography to look like it's all achievements,
Mm-hmm.
they don't really need us. And maybe
Mm-hmm.
you need us and we need you.
Wow.
And so that was a huge gift to say, you got into this program not because you've had a lot of achievements. And I never think I personally had achievements because I've always worked on teams. The teams I've worked on have had achievements like that Saguaro
Yeah.
sacred being
Mm-hmm.
thing. But literally anything that people attribute to me was because of the kindness and collaboration of a dozen other people that tolerated working with me. They could help me see pathways to
Mm-hmm.
fulfill a project that I couldn't see on my own.
That's amazing. Is there ways that you think of? I'm sure you've contemplated the nature of suffering, not only on the individual level, but the collective level, and then through all of history, just the nature of suffering and humanity. It's always a deep subject, and it's one that you could talk about for hours or think about forever. But what do you think the core elements are that cause it, and that could be most useful to prevent it for maybe young people or even people of any age, that you've discovered in your own life and in your own studies? And What do you think the essence is of that, the root of suffering, if that makes sense?
Um, Again, drawing from Richard Rohr and Thomas Merton, I'd say the root of suffering is often about not knowing who we really are and accepting who we really are and spending all our time projecting that shadow self that we really don't want to admit that there's a difference between who we are and that shadow, and that can take the form of overcompensation where we're always projecting that we're better than we are, or it can take that thing that a lot of quieter people do where they just don't want to admit the dark side of their life. Most people have a really hard time accepting the darkness in their own heart and in their own family history without blaming their parents or whatever. Jimmy Hillman says we're the first generation in human history where we blame all our parents for our faults. And the point is we have to own who we are with all the blemishes, wounds, scars, and graces, the grace that's been bestowed upon us by our, not just our parents, but our aunts and uncles and grandparents and dear friends. And so a lot of people who do a lot of damage to others can't reconcile those things. And so they're almost living in a bipolar universe where they're projecting one thing, but their behaviors are really destructive to themselves and to other people around them. And so that's why contemplative practice gives you time and quietude to really face some of that stuff. And if people think that being in contemplative is all about ecstatic experience, a lot of it is dealing with the more painful stuff and giving it the time it needs to heal rather than rushing through it. And you know from your own work with grief as a first responder and firefighter that if you think you're done with it when you've witnessed or been part of a tragic event, and then you say, "Oh, I can move on," it's going to come back and hit you in the face like stepping on a rake.
Yeah.
And so, by having a daily contemplative practice, you probably don't have the stamina to face all that darkness every day, but you condition yourself where on the days that you're open to it, you can do something with it. And it means making peace with it and putting it to rest and saying, that's part of me too. And I think it's really hard for people that are public figures. I don't feel like I'm a public figure of any scale, but anyone who speaks before people regularly is projecting a persona, a mask. That's what persona means. That may be different than how they really feel inside. And contemplative practice allows you to deal with that dissonance, that cognitive dissonance between what you're projecting and how you feel inside.
I love that. Very well articulated. And a lot of it goes to a lot of the Carl Jung world, the Jungian philosophies of the shadow and really getting to the root of things. But you have to create the space and time and have the courage to go into that. And then I always think of the collective history. If you read a book about the Holocaust or you read history, it's painful and it takes courage to read those things. And it's not that we should just dwell in those things, but it is important. And I've realized in my own life that those are where those painful, hard, grieving type curiosities have actually helped me the most. And I'm a baby and I'm always aiming forward to keep doing those things. But I remember floating in those float tanks initially when I was 30, and it was so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I forced myself to go back and pay a lot of money to almost have a forced meditation because I didn't know what meditation was. But same idea was I was dealing with the dis-ease and the disassociation of my ego or my cultural programming and what I was told and believed about myself and what was actually true, and then everything else that comes with those experiences. But I don't think we have that opportunity in our culture because of the momentum and the incentivization structures that drive attention, especially with TikTok and all these things kids have, these apps, and they're
That's
engineered.
right.
They're engineered that way to actually rape attention. And I can see that being probably, in my own opinion, so far, and it's very tiny sliver of the bigger picture. But I'm like, that has to be the worst case scenario for human beings, is to give their attention and life force energy to something that's fast and taking and going. And
Yeah.
it's like we have to. I bet in the future, in the near years, it's going to be a huge need for people to go places for 3 days and cook together and hike together and be
Yeah.
still and unplug, like unplug zones.
Yeah.
So,
And last year, right where we're sitting, we had these desert spirituality workshops. I think 3 or 4 of them with invited uh, speakers from outside our community, who talked about the 1600-year-old tradition of uh, the Christian desert spirituality that began as a reaction to Christianity uh, accepting a hostile takeover by the Roman Empire.
mm-hmm.
And at the moment that the church and the empire merged, thousands of people left Rome and Athens and Jerusalem and went out into the desert to detach from that business model, let us
Right.
say.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
our contemplative practices echo what first happened in the desert of the Seti, where I've been twice or 3 times over the years in Egypt, about 100 miles outside of Cairo, where small monasteries got set up for people who wanted to live together, but they also took care of people scattered in caves over a much larger area. And our word asceticism comes from that desert, seti. And it was a practice of opening your up to the emptiness. The desert is so uncluttered compared to those of us who are constantly checking our phones for TikTok or Facebook or X or whatever these things are, that it serves to break our addictions to those desires that aren't really true human needs. And so we have a 1600-year-old tradition in the Western world that in Christianity that goes even older traditions. One place, when Laurie, my wife, and I were traveling in China, we were canoeing with Chinese guides into this canyon. They said on this side of the canyon walls right here were where the tantric Buddhist contemplatives came down from the Himalayas into the desert here. And on that side was where the first Christians came east as monks to dwell in caves. And further up, we had Zoroastrians, and all of them were exchanging their contemplative practices. The same thing happened in Spain during the period of convivencia from 6th century AD to about the 10th or 12th century AD. And we got Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, but we also got the Kabbalah mystics of the Jewish tradition and the Sufis of Islam, and they were all in dialogue with one another. Their contemplative practice transcended their territoriality about their own faith.
Amazing. What did you see as the similarities of all those contemplative practices that you could speak about?
Well, that's a question that we could talk about for hours.
Forever,
so I don't
yeah.
know if the first things out of my mouth can do them justice. But let me just give you a chant that began as a Buddhist chant that I learned when I was in a Zen center as a 21 or 22-year-old. And it's morphed over the years as I've become a Franciscan. But I'll just give you the 4 lines of it that I say every day that I think have elements of all of those.
Mm.
So let me take a couple breaths before I do it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Although the 10,000 beings are really numberless, I vow to love and save them. Although greed, hatred, and ignorance rise endlessly, I vow to snuff them out and move toward gratitude. Although the universe is vast, it's been damaged, so I vow to restore it. And although the prophet's path is fraught with pitfalls, I vow to humbly follow it through.
That is powerful. Thank you for sharing that.
I've never shared it with anyone.
Man, that's powerful. It's heavy. It's deep, and it's got cross-cultural elements. That's all you probably need to say about that, because you could ponder that forever. So, yeah, thank you.
And I need to talk about that word prophet because I hated it for a long time, and then I read some beautiful books by Ellen Davis and Walter Brueggemann about the prophets, and I love their stepping up to the plate and taking on the world's ethical and moral and spiritual issues. But I felt like, how can anyone in this day and age reach that? And then I heard Richard Rohr say, all of us should aspire to be prophets, and we don't have to be prophets with a capital P. We have to be prophets in that little world that we go into by ourselves at dawn or at the end of the day, or when we walk out of the office into a park at lunchtime, and rather than eating lunch, we just sit in silence. He said, we need to mobilize everyone to find their capacity to be prophets in themselves, not think that someone else can do it for us.
Yeah, it directs you back within.
That's right. I think because of the nature of our culture and even the marketing of spirituality, we tend to succumb to thinking that having a guru can allow us to let the guru do all the thinking for ourselves.
Right. Or a government or something outside of us.
That's right. And I don't mean to use the word guru disparagingly.
Sure.
I'm using it in a cross-cultural way.
Yeah. But it's that outward seeking versus maybe you could just find, and I think I've heard you mention the contemplative practice can be you out working with your hands, your garden, your contemplative garden. It's a perfect example of, like Sanchi Redda, who I just spent a weekend with. She has this incredible Zen garden. And I know that she spent hours and hours and hours with this space that created this. It's a feedback loop, and she can now sit in it and be in it. And it's not like her sitting on a yoga mat and doing this boring mindfulness practice that I'm not knocking it, but it can be so much more. It can be in the shower, the chopping vegetables, your everyday experience.
Well, I'll take you up after we record this to my contemplative garden. There was a remarkable man that lived in our community for just about 3.5 years, part of the year, Martin Moscow, who was a sacred garden designer for the Dalai Lama and did contemplative gardens around the world, and then wrote a book on it. And I was just fascinated by what design concepts he gleaned as essential from his 45 years of being a Buddhist and 30 years of running one of the largest sacred garden design companies in the country. And he helped me design the garden up above
Amazing.
before he died. But my key as a botanist was I wanted it to focus on plants that I could regularly tend and be around, just like you said, as part of my contemplative practice, where their shapes are like mandalas. And we know from studies of people meditating on mandalas, like a visual mantra, and when the golden spiral of an agave that's very much like a mandala is put in the place of the mandala, the drop in cortisol stress chemicals is the same as what happens when you meditate on a mandala.
Amazing.
So I have over 50 species of century plants or agaves up in the contemplative garden, as well as a number of other sacred plants. And that's where I go out with our little Australian shepherd and meditate in the morning and then near sunset. And so when I'm working with the plants there, I'm not just in a what I call the naturalist trance, a contemplative state, but I'm being inoculated by the microbes on the roots of that plant, just as the plant's being inoculated, that I'm getting something back from the soil that has physical health benefits to me, but also emotional and spiritual health benefits. And so having that garden, I think everyone needs, even if you have just a little atrium or a patio on a 5-story building, you can have that sanctuary for yourself, a refuge where you can have that practice each day. You don't have to go to a church or synagogue or mosque or a zendo to do that.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And I look forward to seeing this beautiful garden. It sounds incredible. Even hummingbirds do that to me. You know, I keep some at work at the firehouse, and just sitting there is my favorite thing to communicate with them. And just watching nature has always been my favorite teacher. So,
yeah, I love hummingbirds too. They have the longest migrations in the world if you measure migrations in body lengths. You know, maybe whales travel further in the ocean, but they have big bodies. Hummingbirds have little ones, and ones that I've helped band here in New Mexico have ended up at some of my best friends' houses in Sitka, Alaska.
That's incredible.
The same bird that we put a band on here ended up there, and I got to go up there and say hi to the same rufous hummingbird.
And they recognize faces, I've heard. Is that correct?
When I worked at the Desert Museum, I worked with this gifted woman who managed the hummingbird house there. We were doing a whole set of pollinator gardens, and she said, "Come in with me at before work sometime and see what I do." And as she came into the door of a 50-foot by 75-foot hummingbird house, the hummingbirds all greeted her, and 20 or 30 just hovered in front of her as she loaded the feeders. Some would land on her shoulder. Some would follow her around from feeder to feeder. They knew her personally.
Yeah, that's amazing. I believe that because I know mine and my little local birds, and they're so friendly once you just pay attention to them and actually engage them. And I don't know. I think it's all about actually your relationship to nature that creates that opportunity for the communication to happen.
That's right.
Through my own experience. But
yeah, I had an old wise man mentor in Tucson, and he'd sit out on his patio in the desert and bring Velveeta cheese and Ritz crackers out onto his patio, and 5 different species of lizards would come up and eat cheese and crackers out of his hand, but so not cool. From other people's hands.
Sure.
And he would say, "Oh, that's Henry III." His mother, his grandmother, was the first spiny lizard that ate crackers out of my hand, and then she invited her husband to come up with me because she taught him that they needn't be afraid of me. And now I'm on the 3rd generation.
That's amazing. Wow. That's so cool.
So to have those relationships with any animal or any plant reminds us of the golden rule: do unto others is not only about what we do to other humans, but what we do to other species.
Mm-hmm.
And that reciprocity that you're talking about in your relationship with those hummingbirds, is really key to being human, that it expresses your generosity of spirit, that your kindness extends beyond our own species to others as well.
Mm.
And what would be a better indicator of generosity but that we don't just hold it for people who are like us or for those in our own species, that it's not about our class or faith or race or even species. It's that generosity flows out of our heart freely to any other life that we come into contact with.
I like that. It's nice talking to you. I knew this would be fun. One thing I like to ask people, and I think I ask friends and family members, and it's an important question for me, is if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with people? What would be the most significant thing you could share if you think of anything? You can take your time, but I think that's important to contemplate. It's half the reason I bought this equipment, was to capture those elements.
The gratitude I feel for this short, brief, swift time on Earth. I've always loved that verse in the Bible: "For God so loved the world that He gave His Son to it." He said, "This world is too good for not." God should be present here, in us, among us, and around us, not up in the heavens. That I love the line from the poet Galway Kinnell: "Kiss the mouth that tells you, here, here, here is the world." That when I die, I'm going to feel just this great relief that I become part of that larger cycle of degeneration and decomposition that can enrich the soil where I'm buried, and that my contributions to life here don't stop when I die, but that the microbes will make sure that they recycle what's useful and help other things grow out of it. And so I just have absolutely no fear of death and no remorse about dying. That it's coming sooner rather than later, now at age 72, and that I don't have to worry that my faith has to be built on an emergency evacuation plan to heaven, as Brian McLaren does. My faith is about how good we can be to one another here.
That's powerful. Here. I like that. And I like that your ideas go on. A lot of what you've written and done in your life's work in the meme space. And
yeah. My ideas go on, but also my molecules go on.
yeah, both seem to.
I don't know.
The genes
I
and
can't
memes.
tell much difference between the two anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe ideas are more ephemeral than the molecules.
Yeah, and they probably at the end of the day are both vibrational electromagnetic things that we can't put into form. So
yeah, that's the other thing that I'm just convinced of, the non-duality. Like, we now know that energy is both particles and waves, and that consciousness is probably like that. It's consciousness isn't some particle in our brain, but it's these waves of connections between us and what we're immersed in and what's immersed in us. So just non-dualistic thinking is why I love science and art and try to combine them together wherever I can, and why I love thinking about the desert, that it's not this desolate place of death and deprivation. It's also this place of elegance and sparsity and openness and luminosity. It's not one or the other, it's both.
What is your relationship to fear? Because I remember you even speaking about your fear of public speaking when you first wrote that book. I think The Desert Smells Like Rain, or one of your books that was really popular, and you had to go speak in front of a large...
For this, I think the second book I wrote, Gathering the Desert, I wrote, as I said, I stuttered and lisped, and I wrote because I didn't want to speak. In certain cases, I didn't speak at all for days, or it was uncomfortable to engage in conversations because I felt people were, como se dice, distracted by my speech impediments and all of that, and couldn't hear what I was saying. So I just didn't go in with a heart toward thinking that I'd be good at it. So then I write books, and then a second book I write, they say, you're invited to New York to give a lecture at the American Museum of Natural History for a half hour after a lunch in front of some of the most prominent scientists and nature writers in the country.
Jeez.
And I just panicked. I panicked, and I told a friend who ironically was living in the house that the desert writer Ed Abbey had lived in before. I said, "You're a speech therapist. What do? I'm scared to death." And she walked me through that. She gave me some of the best speech lessons on how to overcome stuttering and all of that. Brilliant woman. But I still have to, like when you came into the room and said, okay, we're close to recording, I put a hat on, or a lot of times I put a vest on as a protective security blanket, because it takes like a chemical reaction of getting over the hump for me to feel comfortable in it. It's not fear anymore. It's just that I need to know someone a little bit of who they are before I can open up and feel like you can deal with any lisps or stutters that I might have, and you're still listening in a way where you can hear me.
And it looks like you used your fear to motivate you as opportunity as well. You went and seeked the therapist instead of saying no or backing out. It was more of an opportunity, which is pretty cool.
Yeah,
or the resistance, at least the initial.
No, I think you're right. I mean, fear has so many dimensions. So I have not just fear of public speaking that I have to get over, like stage fright still, even when I know it's 40 friends. I was just at Harvard and there was 10 friends, and I must have been up half the night before, just with anxiety. But at another level, my fears are more for the world than for me personally. I'm so heartbroken by the fact that a place we call the Holy Lands for multiple religions is just in a war again that's involving deaths in 7 to 8 countries now, and that we haven't outgrown our predilection for war after thousands of years, that we're damaging not only people who are more like us and unlike us, but we're damaging the lands that so many prophets walked on that still are meaningful to those people. So even if the war stops tomorrow, that collective grief,
Yeah.
post-traumatic stress that you and I have talked about earlier, and the damage to the land goes on for decades more. So we're doing that karmic cycle where another generation has to live through that cycle of what to deal with that traumatic stress.
Mm.
And we know from everything in American culture now that 75 years after the Holocaust during World War II for Jewish people, and 95 years after the Holocaust of Armenians, and 20 years after the Holocaust of Hutu and Tutsi people in Africa, that we're in another Holocaust now.
Yeah.
That we can hardly say that word about it. President Biden on Holocaust Memorial Day could not simply bring himself to admit to the world that he was heartbroken that we're in another one, because it's so indicting of our whole society that we don't have any way to put the brakes on that much terror.
Yeah.
And so that's where my fear is right now. I fear that one more child in Palestine or Israel, even if he's not killed or starved to death, is going to live with the nightmares of that horror for the next 30 years, and that wound will take so much
and their
for them to recover. That's right, that karmic cycle.
Yep.
And so that's how I think of fear today, not about anything that can happen to me personally.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for sharing that. That's important stuff to talk about, because I think everyone's feeling it right now.
Yeah, and
it's important to start at least putting words to it sometimes at a special time. It doesn't have to be all day long, but.
And it's that odd thing where I'm of Semitic heritage, Arabs, Jews, and 5 other people were of the Semitic languages. We have more in common. When I go to Israel, I see funny things that just remind me of my Arab family. I've lectured in Israel, Palestine, Oman, Egypt, and I have this huge feeling of deep affinity with all of those people, not just Arabs.
It's amazing.
And I think that most of the kids protesting right now just want wars to stop, where we're not killing more kids. Their language may be rough and rude, but my generation's language was rough and rude in trying to articulate why the Vietnam War was so damaging to the whole world. And I don't think most of the kids in those marches are anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. I had a talk here in Patagonia with 2 Jewish kids who were sitting in, who got belly clubbed and tear gassed, talking to Palestinian kids on the University of Arizona campus a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And they said, we love our Jewish culture, but we also wish the best for Palestinian people. And I said, I want to be these kids, to have the courage to walk across that line and say, I'm more like you than we have differences, and I want to show my support for you at this terrible time for your people. I just thought, those kids are 24-year-old saints. Most of us at that age don't have that graciousness of spirit.
Wow, that's powerful.
So again, to me, my fear isn't about, I have no control over the political stuff, but it's, my fear is that we don't step up to the plate in a spiritual way and learn from this darkness that's upon us.
We live in interesting times, but I suppose it's history. There's never been a time that was there. It's not like there's been a peaceful time. So we're in our time, and I could see where I resonate with that for sure.
And that despite all of that, trying to be involved in Muslim, Christian, Jewish peace and reconciliation work, I have more hope than I have fear. I have more faith in other people than I have despair. I couldn't keep on writing if my
if you were nihilistic
tank of goodwill was empty. And and wouldn't run.
That's beautiful. Yeah. That's the trap, is to get that nihilism and to say, nothing matters and we're not going to make it. But yeah, you still have some fight in you and some fuel in you and hope in you and belief. So that's always nice.
Yeah.
I'm curious, before we end this conversation, because I've taken quite a bit of your time, what's in your little medicine pouch here, or this necklace that you're wearing?
Oh,
it's cool, little hummingbird.
Yeah, this is from the Kongkak or Seri Indian people that my wife and I have not a second home, but a small cabin, 55 years old, that we've fixed up on the beach of the Sea of Cortez. And these people are so dear and have been such good friends to me. In their language, they call me Horny Toad. And this is the 50th year of me visiting them. And my wife and I have had this cabin in one of their villages for 20 years. And she ran the COVID prevention and treatment program while I was really her chauffeur. And I was also helping the Tohono O'odham get medical supplies across the border fence to their tribal members on the Mexican side of the border. So during COVID, we were in no way in isolation. We were in service. And I have to say, my wife's work as a public health professional and a trainer of these wonderful women who are curanderas, and she's helped them get certification so that they can legitimately do healthcare in clinics, not along with doctors and nurses. Her work is far more important than mine at this point. It's just so tangible. She's helping save lives, and I've learned so much from her that if I just have to be her driver and carry her boxes the rest of my life, I feel like I'm doing my part to help the world.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate your time. This has been really nice connecting with you on your land and your home. So it's been an honor for me, and I'm so grateful that we could capture this and share it with other people. And I'm grateful to know you. Well,
let's both express our gratitude to your listeners who don't find something like this unless they're on their own journey. That the people you attract are attentive to the world in a way that I think we should all celebrate and be thankful for. And so we are just one more small excuse to help people on their own journeys. That each of you has a voice as important as ours. You have a life story as important as ours. You've helped people in ways that I certainly can, and I'm just grateful for all of you listeners who do whatever you do in your community that matters to your heart, because I'm sure it helps other people.
I love that. Completely agree, 100%. So I'm grateful for this.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gary.
Well, let's go look at gardens.
Let's do it. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.